Hello, everyone. First, I want to say a special thank you to the World Association for Psychosocial Rehabilitation for inviting me all the way from Denmark to the beautiful city of Vancouver to speak on the topic of lived experiences as a basis for mental health service transformation. But as you can see, I'm not there due to circumstances beyond my control, and I'm really very disappointed about that, but never mind. Anyway, first a bit about myself, and to situate myself with regards to such a huge topic, which is lived experience, peers, and mental health services. I'm a voice hearer, and I've had voices since I was a young child. Yet, like everyone else, I'm so much more than labels we use to describe ourselves. I am, for example, a psychologist trained in open dialogue tradition. I'm also part of WHO and their quality rights, a psychiatric nurse, an avid photographer, a woman, a cat lover, and I could just go on. However, and this is my focus for today, I'm also a psychiatric survivor. And I use this term deliberately, meaning I call out systemic abuse and I refuse to turn a blind eye to my embodied experience of being subjected to 10 years in the psychiatric system, where I was labeled a chronic and incurable schizophrenic, placed on the highest pension, and all the things that happened to me as a consequence of that. This means I speak from a peer position that is outside of the psychiatric system, as I tend to cause discomfort for the system. This brings me to peers and lived experience. And because I have so little time, I'm going to be a bit binary, a bit black and white, knowing full well there are endless nuances. And I say there, and I'm going to say that there are peers who work within the system, and then there are those who work outside, such as myself, outside of the system, I'm meaning. This means my talk is from the perspective of looking in from the outside at my fellow peer workers, and which is why I have chosen the title, Has Lived Experience Outlived Itself in Mental Health Services, or Can It Still Shape Meaningful Change? Advocacy and recovery movements, they really took off in the 1980s. And for example, the Hearing Voices movement also has its roots in the 1980s. Peer support as a service started in the late 1980s and early 1990s, depending on which country we're looking at. Denmark, for example, was much later, and 2013 was when the first formalized peer started to work within the services. But what is a peer worker typically described as being? For the most part, I found the description as being somewhat fluffy, and many workplaces find it really difficult to define or place peer workers. However, if I'm going to focus on Denmark, then this is taken from their official Danish peer network, the description. So this is quotes. Peer workers in Denmark. A peer worker primarily works based on their own experiences with mental distress and recovery, which, through training and practical experience, are transformed into experience competencies. The latest statistics available in Denmark on the number of peer workers in psychiatry is from 2021. So it's not the most up to date per se, but that's the latest we have. So in 2021, there was a little over 200 peer workers in psychiatry. Typical for them, as elsewhere, they have taken a peer worker education, are paid minimum wages, and most are working part-time. Discrimination and stigmatization is unfortunately very present, which is actually also very consistent with much of the research on this topic. In fact, the Danish Psychiatric Foundation just 2 weeks ago released a study that surprised them, as it showed that people who had or had had mental distress were still being stigmatized and discriminated against in particular within the medical settings and job centres. So, unclear job boundaries, low pay, part-time jobs, and stigmatization already there creates a challenge for peer workers, especially as their job is to promote hope and recovery, combat stigmatization, and, in the ideal world, transform services. Now, that is not to say that peer workers are not valued. They are. We are. Especially as we can often spend far more time with patients and so listen to their stories, share experiences, and have compassion for their suffering, as we too know what it is like. And this cannot be underestimated. But there is a big challenge which tends to remain unseen for a variety of reasons and makes the dream of peer workers and their lived experience transforming mental health services very difficult to achieve. To see what I mean, we need to look at three words and how they intertwine, resulting in one of the biggest challenges we have in this field, and that is ongoing systemic abuse, which I posit has not been resolved yet. Those three words are trauma, abuse, and erasure. I'm inspired by Judith Herman's latest book, Truth and Repair, when I say these words. The idea of peer workers has been seen as something profoundly positive with a huge potential. But unfortunately, what has tended to happen is they have become extensions of the system, where relationships between peer workers and service users are construed in a hierarchically, in contradiction to the horizontal relationships of grassroots user survivor developed peer support. Peer workers are often expected to use the language of the system, conform to expectations dictated by psychiatric wards, and at the same time be beacons of hope, while not challenging the underlying biomedical understandings of distress. This combination, when we change the language, conform to power structures, and neutralize stories, we are, according to Herman, blurring the distinction between trauma and abuse, muddying the waters, so to speak. Therefore, it is important to look at the distinction between trauma and abuse. Trauma is personal. In other words, it's subjective. It is a shock to the mind and body, disrupting meaning and meaning-making, shattering sense of self or parts of self, and is emotionally overwhelming. However, trauma can be healed, and this is really important. This can be done, for example, through therapy, connections, and good relationships. It can be reframed and integrated. There are a huge number of possibilities. The important thing is that trauma can be healed. Abuse, on the other hand, is objective. It is about what happened, not about how it feels. It involves violations of power, boundaries being breached, and is morally wrong. It is not to be reframed or renamed. It demands, as Herman states, truth, recognition, and repair. And for this to happen, it needs witnesses. For example, rape is a violation of power, and assault on body and mind is morally wrong, a crime. Part of the healing is a recognition of the abuse for what it is. When trauma and abuse get blurred within a system, we open the door to systemic abuse. And when this happens, trauma gets distorted to hide the abuse, and the power of the system is then used to deny that trauma and abuse exist. But how is this done? And this is where erasure comes in. A peer has most likely experienced trauma through abuse, and importantly, they can also have experienced abuse within the system. To talk about that is uncomfortable and unwelcome. An example can be someone who has experienced childhood sexual abuse and rape, saying that forced medication has all the hallmarks of being assaulted again, and expressing their outrage and embodied sense of harm over such an act having been perpetrated upon them. This inconvenient truth must be erased, just as abuse in general is often watered down, re-explained in professional language, or silenced. And instead, topics that are deemed safe are brought into the forefront, and peers are therefore encouraged to speak about the subjective. But how is this blurring of trauma and abuse created? There are a variety of ways. One is ensuring that those who refuse to let go of their embodied outrage remain on the outside. However, for those peers working on the inside, the system will often erase much of their potential. Psychiatric hospitals are hierarchically and traditionally very rigid, which means that peer workers are more often than not placed one step above the patient. This brings with it a whole host of challenges, not least stigma and discrimination, as often they will still be viewed as glorified patients. The rigid system espousing a biological understanding of distress discourages other explanations that don't conform. Thus, a peer worker can listen empathetically to alternative explanations to the biological model, I'm thinking, to a patient's distress or reactions to being treated in certain ways and try to support them. But if they try to bring this higher up in the system, it opens the door to potential erasure. It is because you have been a patient yourself you're saying that. Or aren't you overreacting? Or perhaps you're not ready to work here after all. In other words, peer workers are exposed to contradictory demands on their identities, where they can both be seen as empowered survivors and unstable employees, depending on the context, and thereby creating conditions that potentially undermine and tokenize peer workers. So to return to the three words, erasure, trauma, and abuse, we can see that using techniques to erase abuse by folding it into the subjective experience of trauma means that as peer workers, we deny the possibility of truly witnessing, naming, or telling the truth, not just to the patient, but also to oneself. This is harmful on many levels, but perhaps the biggest harm is it prevents the potential transformation of mental health services that is hoped for, because it does not address abuse, especially systemic abuse, and continues to support the status quo of traditional psychiatry. So has lived experience outlived itself in mental health services? I think that depends on what one's expectations are. If one wants peer workers who can empathize, listen to patients, be a ray of hope for all in the system, and contribute to soothing staff and perpetuating the narrative that things are on the whole okay and staff are doing a good job in psychiatry by not naming the elephant in the room, then no, we have not outlived lived experience. And again, I want to reiterate the importance and power of being met by someone who understands because of their lived experience cannot be underestimated and can always have the potential to shape meaningful changes on an individual level. If, however, the idea is to transform mental health systems and services, reduce stigma, and truly create meaningful change where human rights are in the forefront, then I would posit yes, lived experience has outlived itself in mental health services. So, what do you all mean? And I would love to have been there today and shared this discussion. Instead, I can't, unfortunately. So I'm just going to leave it out there and hope my talk can inspire a good discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.